Okay guys, welcome back to the channel. Giving you a different backdrop today, but there's going to be a reason for it because of the topic. But also, what do you think about my new hat? While I was in LA, I contracted with a few boutiques to come up with, I want to relaunch my clothing line, but strictly with hats, and especially hats with horns, cowboy hats with horns. So we're coming up with different design ideas and different price points, and maybe I'll offer it as merch on the channel because so many people have asked me, can you get me a hat? Where do you get these hats? Yada, yada, yada. So anyway, that's to come. But I'm so far behind in content, I still have to cover all the Italy visits and all kinds of stuff to share with you guys. But I wanted to leapfrog that real quick because for whatever reason recently in my inbox email, I've just gotten a plethora of questions about a preamp. Do you need a preamp? Should you use a DAC with a preamp? Yada, yada, yada. And unfortunately, that's a question I can't answer easily via email, and certainly numerous times. So I decided to do this video real quick, although it might be a little extensive. I even made some notes here I might have to refer to, because here's the deal, guys. If people just knee-jerk tell you, yeah, you always need a preamp, no, you don't need a preamp, just use a DAC with a volume control, either one is definitely primitive answers, and they really don't understand how things work if they're making those kind of generalizations. There's so many variables involved that I'm going to walk you through in this video, the variables, and also give you some recommendations, and also how to troubleshoot things where if you have a mismatch, it's not always about sometimes buying a new piece or adding a piece in the equation. You can just understand how things work, then you know why you may be having a problem and why you may not be having a problem. So I think it's worthwhile to do this video because there's so many bad answers. I see this constantly, this question come up a lot on Facebook, and you'll just get knee-jerk one-sentence answers, and it's so sad that people really don't spend the time to understand what they're buying. We're audiophiles. You don't have to become an engineer, and I'm not even qualified to get into the total weeds, but what I'm trying to do with this video is shortcut my learning curve over the years. It's not like I'm talking down to you. I'm going through the same learning curve, but I can share with you now what I know, and it may help you because there is big minefields with choosing the wrong option for your preamp versus amp, and I'm gonna give you some examples. But let's start off first with what the preamp goal is in most cases. At its basic level, it's just a volume control and input selector. And for many people, that's all they need, especially if you only have one input or just a couple. But there are some variables there. Input selecting, let's just talk about that. It's very easy to understand. If you have lots of inputs from different sources, you're going to need a preamp or something that has that ability in all in one box. But one thing that you need to worry about, and I've seen this happen a lot with people even blowing their speakers, is those inputs may come in at different levels of gain and voltages and whatnot. Without getting into the weeds, basically you may have seen this yourself. You set the volume control for your digital at this, but then when your input for your LP, analog, tape, or your turntable, it's a totally different volume, and that volume all of a sudden is too loud for one input versus the other. And people have even blown their speakers by making that mistake and switching the inputs while they're playing and not having the volume attenuated per input. So one thing that I'm very impressed with preamps, and one thing I encourage you to start looking at, and shout out to MBL, one off the cuff that I know that does this, but having input trims per input is very important. And most digital-based preamps can do that as well, all-in-one boxes, surround sound processors. They do that, and that's an advantage that you shouldn't overlook. Again, I'm not about fancy chassis, fancy name. I'm about the function that it does. And if your preamp does not allow you volume trims per input, that could be an issue. Otherwise, input selection is pretty basic. Let's talk about the other aspect of it I mentioned, which is the volume control. Tons of different volume control philosophies, autoformers, resistor ladders, potentiometers, all of those can be good. But understanding the pluses and minuses of each one is very important because they may have repercussions down the chain and for total synergy. But for the most part, all of those volume controls are adequate. But one thing you shouldn't overlook is the quality of what they're using, the quality of the resistors, the quality of the potentiometer. In terms of if you're neurotic about parts, if you're neurotic about capacitors and all these other things, wire, internal wire and all that, you should be even more neurotic for preamp on that quality of that volume control. Because I can tell you that makes a huge difference, even more so in my opinion, than the capacitors inside and whatnot. So pay attention to that. I can tell you with my Blue Hawaii head amp with the Alps upgraded volume control, I can swear that that's part of the large reason why, as a whole, my rig for headphones sounds a lot better than most others I hear. The combination of the stacks with that volume control and that head amp. Otherwise, that head amp, Blue Hawaii head amp, is pretty basic tube amp, but that volume control I think is special. And again, that's not the only one you can use. Another one, if you just need a passive preamp with volume control and input selector, I still will recommend to this day, it's been out for over 20 plus years, but the Placet passive line stage, well, this is the Placet preamp. They do have an active line stage in case you need gain. I'm gonna get to that in a second. But if you just need an awesome volume control with all these Vichy resistors, very high quality, lots of money in that, and an input selector, that Placet still to this day could be all you need and be giving you the utmost optimal performance. But in a lot of cases, there's a third function that a preamp does, and it's add gain. And some have different philosophies of how much the preamp gain, should be involved. A lot, little, and mating it to your amp is when we start really getting into variables that you need to consider. And if people aren't bringing this up when they're giving you their recommendations, then that's a red flag that they probably are just pushing whatever they want to make money on, or they don't even understand the potential issues. In most cases, people build a preamp with modest amount of gain and they assume amps in the same range and they will work together. They may never be totally perfect, but they will work together enough where it's immaterial for most people's standards and what they want. But when we start talking about perfection, no compromises, perfect synergy, and when you want to get neurotic about capacitors, well then get neurotic about your amp and preamp mating perfectly. And that's why I push, like I did with the Aries Syrah and MBLs and others, PBN. If people can make both and they design them for both, it's better to get this at those price points than this. Or you thinking you can combine them, or you buy poor pieces, like you bought a bright preamp or a bright amp and then you made it with a warm preamp because you want to make lemonade out of lemons. Well, you may make lemonade out of lemons, but I guarantee you it's not fresh squeezed. You're basically jimmy rigging things to get that synergy. Get it done right in the first place. But getting back to the topic of gain, it's very important because that's where you can have mismatches as well. If you buy, like we talked about with Aries Syrah, they put a lot of gain in their preamp and very little in their amp. So if you buy their amp and don't have a preamp with this much gain, then just a normal preamp with normal gain, a lot of people have run into problems where their amp doesn't get to the volume that they want. On the flip side, if you've got too much gain in the preamp and your amp, then your volume control, you've seen this with a lot of potentiometers, people that can only go between 6 o'clock 0 and then like 10 or 11 o'clock on the dial, and they're full range. They can't play it much lighter. So their range of control on their volume control is so little because they've got too much gain. So having that equation optimized for you and being able to use the proper volume control. And again, even in the digital realm, you don't want to attenuate a whole lot because there are differences between an analog volume control and a digital. And the more attenuation you're doing, whether it's in the analog realm or the digital realm, there are repercussions for that. So getting the gain synergized between two pieces, I think, is something, unless you know what you're doing, and you can hire people like Rick Brown or people that really know what they're doing, that understand and will ask the questions, put things together for you, then you should let the designer do it themselves, or make sure you've done your homework before doing that. Let me refer to my notes just to make sure I'm not missing anything. Yeah, pretty much. Well, also, there's obviously difference in philosophy of tubes versus solid state. And obviously, some people think that preamp is a tone control. Like I was talking about, a warm one, made it with a bright amp, you can use it as a tone control. I don't frankly believe in doing that. It's just a minefield of, yeah, you can make lemonade, but like I said, it's not going to be fresh squeezed, and you're really not doing yourself any justice in the long run. You may make it more amenable on certain recordings, but other recordings not. You should go for every piece in your equipment for transparency and truthfulness. Over the long haul, with most recordings, that will pay off. And frankly, whether you talk to tube preamp designers or solid state preamp designers, they will basically tell you the same thing. They're going for the same thing. It's not like they are intentionally making a colored preamp. Some will. There's a few out there that are super colored, and intentionally so. But for the most part, it's just tube designers think that tubes are more linear. And certainly in a preamp, you're not getting as much of that harmonic distortion that you get from tubes in an amp. So they feel like a tube preamp is giving you the highest linearity and pristine transparency and reproduction. That's what they're comfortable with, their design philosophy, and that's what they choose. Solid state people are the same way. They're going for utmost detailed transparency as well with their choice in parts and stuff. So it's not, I don't think any designer is intentionally designing a preamp for you to use to tone control. If you want a tone control, guys, buy an actual digital EQ, buy a preamp that has that already in it, and I'll get to my recommendations in a little while to get onto that topic. But guys, do not use that and primitive EQs of cables, preamps, even tube rolling. Now with tube preamps, yes, you can roll the tubes and then color the sound quite a bit, because there are some tubes that are not all that that are colored. But in any case, that's outside the topic of whether you need a preamp or not. Let's get into some of those variables again, like input impedance. If you, on top of the gain mismatch issue that I talked about, if your amp has a relatively low input impedance, and basically what that is in layman's terms is, what is its resistance to any signal coming into it? How friendly is it to the signal coming into the amp? And they have a way of measuring that. It's usually between, I think, 10 to 100K ohms. And those are usually within the parameters of okay. Obviously, the higher, the better. But in any case, one thing you have to look at, and that's what happened with that example I showed in the with the JC1 Parasounds, is that if it's on the low end of even acceptable, and then you have an extremely long run, like 40 feet of cable, that's high capacitance. That's another variable we're going to talk about. From a preamp that's either passive or doesn't have buffered outputs. Buffered is just another level above passive, where it'll at least give you some drive of the cables. It's not actively adding gain per se, but it's going to drive the cables better. And that can get you better results for long cable runs into a lower input impedance amp. All of these things may be a little bit confusing to you. You may never have heard of these things. You may have seen it in John Atkinson measurements. Why is he talking about these things? Well, these are the reasons why you do want to understand these things, because these variables might matter. If you're just running normal cables, low capacitance cables, short runs with an acceptable input impedance amp and an acceptable preamp, then that's great. But I'll tell you a little example that happened to me. I had a phenomenal tube preamp, Conrad Johnson 17LS. Conrad Johnson is known for making some of the best preamps in history, and was one of the standard setters forever with their ART. That was the one that was in every room back in the day. It was either ARC or Conrad Johnson, and the Conrad Johnson ART was a great, and still to this day would be a great preamp, tube preamp. Well, at the time I couldn't afford the ART, but the 17LS, and if you still get one today, I think it'd still be phenomenal. But the problem was, the only thing that it was different from the ART, if you really looked under the hood, talked to people in the know, is that it just couldn't drive long cable runs with the amount of tubes it had compared to the ART, which was a little more friendly to whatever kind of amp you wanted to mate it to and whatever cable distances and capacitance. It could blow through most of those issues. But understanding that nuance, and then in my system, when I got the 17LS, I made sure to put it really close to my amp, had a friendly input impedance amp, low capacitance cables. I was able to get basically Conrad Johnson ART level performance at their next tier down because I understood how the pieces worked. I understood what the trade-off was at that lower point, and then I mitigated it. And this is where understanding how things work, having people that give you this advice one way or the other, learning it yourself or getting this advice can save you money and get you better performance. Very important, and that's why I'm doing this video, because there's so much primitive information out there, primitive conclusions. That could have been a disaster for me if I had long runs, long capacitance cable, poor input impedance amp. That 17 LS would have been a disaster. And then my dealer would have said, oh, you just need to buy the ART. Might not have told me, just put it closer, low capacitance cable, whatnot. So again, this is helping you hopefully understand the nuances and variables involved. Now, I'll give you another example. When we talk about the big question I've been getting for whatever reason is, should you get the preamp and DAC all in one, or should you get a separate box, preamp versus, DAC in a separate box? First of all, guys, it doesn't matter if it's in a separate box. A lot of people could that make these DAC preamps all combined. They could cut the box in half and say, this is the preamp, this is the amp. Again, it comes into all of these variables. How was it designed that makes a difference versus a separate box, okay? So let me give you a perfect example that happened to me. I had the Lampezator Big 7 balanced DAC/preamp all in one box, huge chassis. Here's another case where they could have carved it in half and said, here's the preamp, here's the DAC, separate, and sold them separately. But when you have a Lampezator DAC preamp combined, the last thing you want to do is put a preamp after it. I mean, it just defeats the whole purpose. Doesn't make any sense on top of the extra cost and cabling, and just aesthetically, it's just dumb. But if you know certain things about the design and the tubes and the Lampezator, you can have issues where, at least in my case, when I initially hooked it up, I had a super long run. I wasn't using the lowest capacitance cables, and into an amp that had unfriendly input impedance. And I could tell that it didn't like that. There were certain, it's not going to be night and day on every song immediately, but you will be able to tell over the long haul when the piece is struggling and having some issues in certain areas when these are mismatched. And I could tell that was an issue. Then I researched what was the tubes that were being used, what was its ability to drive the cables, much like the Conrad Johnson example I just gave, and found out, even talking to the distributor, these tubes are not really meant as good for driving along cable runs. These other tubes would be better. Or obviously you could shorten the run, use low capacitance cable, use an amp with a higher input impedance, more friendly input impedance. All of these variables are much better to fix than sticking a preamp in between the Lampezator DAC and the amp, which a lot of people would just primitively recommend, and that would work, because then you'd be breaking up the run and then they drive the cables. But you'd have all that extra cost, all that extra stuff in the signal path, all that unnecessary, when if you just understood what are the trade-offs for their designs that they believe in for purity, and what are the limitations and trade-offs, and mitigate those, then you understand better whether, yes, you can go with an all-in-one DAC preamp, whether you need a preamp or you don't. So there's still going to be many people that need a standalone box preamp, but that's becoming less important in going forward. The reason being is that kind of box is not that valuable anymore, just for input switching and volume control and a little bit of gain. That can be done as part of the DAC and within the infrastructure, optimized grounding planes, all taken care of. And if anything should be separated, maybe the power supply or anything like that, different channels. It's much better to be done all in one box in general, I think, nowadays, because, and doing it digitally, with one exception I'm going to give you in a second. Digitally, I think, is the best way to do it, because what I recommend, let's get to my recommendations now, and this is why I'm showing you in the background, the Primaire, and then my mini DSP is here, and then I'm going to show you my ultimate preamp DAC. But the Primaire is a surround sound processor. Now, why would I recommend that as a DAC? I've got it here, I'm auditioning it for my home theater, but I would easily recommend it over almost any preamp out there right now on sonic metrics alone. But on top of that, what it does now is not only give you the DAC, not only does it give you gain in the preamp and input selecting, it allows you to trim the outputs so that you don't have that issue I brought up earlier. And it gives you bass management. It gives you the ability to send signals to 2 subs and control the crossover points. This one's a little more limited in 2-channel and for crossover bass management than my mini DSP, which is even further down here. That's another one. I've had Megadollar Lampizators, Wadias, Conrad Johnson. I've heard everything out there. There's still a few cost no object ones I'm going to recommend for you guys in a second that still like the individual box. But I would put either of these, guaranteed 100 out of 100 people, blind test, these will outperform almost any preamp out there, or you will be able to hear the difference just in the bass, because the bass management tools in here are so far superior to a normal preamp. There's no preamp out there that can beat types of preamps like this that have these functions. On top of the input trimming and all the things to protect you, these are so much more superior than traditional preamps nowadays. And people have got to get past this, just like we heard about with active crossover. If you really want ultimate performance, get with the program, guys. I can prove it to anybody. Bring whatever preamp you want over. The biggest dollar preamp you want. Let's put it up against this. In the bass alone, I can just play bass tones. You will be able to hear the difference because of what these can do, especially if you have subs and you're trying to mate it. So there's so much power nowadays that the preamp in this case could be the heart of your system, could be the most important piece in terms of getting you that utmost potential of your system and the rest of your gear. And also even navigating room issues, because both of these come with DAC, which is a form of room correction. But, okay, let's say you don't believe in that, you're still stubborn, you want to do traditional preamp for whatever reason. Or you buy into a philosophy like MBL, PBN, Aries Surratt. Well, obviously, those are ones I would easily recommend. Aries Surratt preamp, phenomenal, especially when mated in their ecosystem. The PBN, obviously another one made to make with their stuff. The one that I will give super props to in the cost no object area is the MBL preamp. And one thing I wanted to give shout out to MBL on is, number one, they do the volume trim in a traditional design per output, protects you from that issue. And then on top of that, even at their new budget all-in-one streamer DAC, everything combined, they are doing most of that digital, but then they're still using an analog volume control. Now, the value of an analog volume control is that if you're doing a lot of attenuation, a digital volume control can actually, you can lose some dynamic range. So this materiality levels and whether it's audible or not, depending on how much you're attenuating in the digital domain. But in theory, an analog volume control does have some advantages over a digital. So MBL is putting an analog volume control in their all digital, all in one piece. So I can give them shout out for not only great looks on their Megadollar preamp and the trims of the volume of the inputs, but even on their more budget pieces in digital all in one pieces, they are trying to do everything ideal. Now, it doesn't have the bass management, I don't think. I haven't seen that part of it yet, and some other things that these do. But if you in that traditional realm, cost no object, want cool stuff, those are the companies I would look at. Conrad Johnson still makes great stuff. Steve McCormick with FMC Audio, he makes custom preamps for your system. And he did that in the cost no object acapella Spheron system that I visited. When you have a preamp made for you, then he's considering, what are you mating it with? What are you going to do? He's going to ask you all these questions such that when you get the customized preamp for you, it is synergized with whatever gear you have. So if you don't want to stay in the same ecosystem of a brand, then having a custom preamp made is that next level to get you that synergy. And I give props to people like Steve McCormick who have always done that with his gear, allowing you to have customization to fit your needs. He's even customized my amps too. That's what I look for. And to me, that's high end, more so and more bespoke than buying something off of assembly line with cool gauges, lights, and just another one that's a box on the shelf and out of a warehouse. So hopefully this is helpful. But I'm going to show you the number one DAC preamp combo that of all, I have it, and very few people do. I'm going to rotate the camera, and in the back here is the Bach Grand. Now, this gives you not only everything that the others do, in fact, it's superior. It has, instead of direct, it has ORC, which is far superior. In-ear, ear pin measurements, which are far superior than these 1 foot away quasi-anechoic chamber measurements to tell you exactly what's happening and tailoring the sound for you, not somebody else, not for generality, not for estimates of mic positions around your head. This is tailoring it exactly for you. So you have that plus the crosstalk cancellation, plus a crossover. You can make this with subs. Plus, you can use it as an active crossover, rip the crossover out of your speakers and use this as an active crossover now. We talked about that with Andrew Jones, and I think you've even seen, I saw a video with Paul McGowan. PS Audio said they would do active too if it's sold. Well, I'm going to push as far as I can to help move the needle here because this is superior. It's a superior solution. This preamp and DAC, it's a point-to-point wired, state-of-the-art DAC, 6-channel DAC. Most DACs you get aren't 6-channel DACs. German engineering behind it, pedigree. Everything point-to-point wiring, linear power supplies, crosstalk cancellation, you name it, this piece has it all. So if you want the ultimate of what a preamp can do and be the true heart of your system. Oh, and gain too. If you have amps with different gains, it's got tabs in here he can change to change the gain. It's about as simple a preamp it is, straight wire with gain, but he can choose the gain that'll mate better with your amp. So everything is thought of with this piece. To me, this is true high-end. It covers all the bases from active crossover, sub, bass management, frequency response, time domain correction. Everything is done in this piece that none of these other DACs with the volume control, none of these separate preamps can do. This does it all. Easily superior, easily A-B-able. I'll take it to anybody's house and we can A-B it against anything out there. It will be so easy, blindfolded, to tell which one's better and which one makes the bigger difference than almost anything, even more so sometimes than speaker changes. So just wanted to give you this video. Hopefully it was a little more comprehensive than most advice that people give online, Facebook, and all this stuff. And my learning curve has helped you at least a little bit. All right, guys, sign up, subscribe, and we'll see you back here soon.